Hey, everyone, and welcome back to Danis Podcast. If you're new here, a big welcome. Hit that subscribe button so you don't miss any of our episodes as we dive into the moments in history that shaped the world as we know it today. Today, we're talking about the Cold War, a conflict that didn't involve direct fighting between the main superpowers, but rather shaped alliances, drove technological advances, and had a massive impact on the world map. So settle in as we go through every twist and turn, from the start of this global standoff to its end. Alright, to understand the Cold War, we need to go back to the end of World War II in 1945. Europe was in ruins, millions of lives were lost, and countries were struggling to recover. But instead of the usual, war ends and peace resumes, World War II left behind new tensions. Two superpowers emerged, the United States and the Soviet Union. They had joined forces to defeat Nazi Germany, but they had vastly different ideas about how the world should look afterward. In one corner, you had the United States, standing for democracy and capitalism, freedom for people to vote, own property, and build businesses. In the other corner was the Soviet Union, led by Joseph Stalin, championing communism, a system where the state controlled nearly every aspect of life. This divide quickly turned into a clash. In fact, Winston Churchill gave it a name in his famous Iron Curtain speech in 1946. He said, "An Iron Curtain has descended across the continent," referring to how the Soviets controlled Eastern Europe and cut it off from the West. Just imagine a big wall dividing Europe into two halves, with people, culture, and even ideas struggling to get through. So why Cold War? Well, unlike the World Wars, this was a war without direct battles between the main powers. Instead, it was fought through intimidation, spying, proxy wars, propaganda, and technology races. Both sides knew that a direct war would likely end in nuclear destruction, and so the US and the Soviet Union started competing in other ways. Think of it as a high-stakes rivalry, with the whole world watching. Now, let's talk about the arms race. After the US dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, it held a monopoly on nuclear weapons, at least for a few years. But in 1949, the Soviet Union shocked the world by testing its own atomic bomb. This kicked off a nuclear arms race, with both superpowers trying to build bigger, more destructive weapons. By the 1950s, we'd entered the era of the hydrogen bomb, even more powerful than the atomic bomb. It was a dangerous game of one-upmanship, and by the 1960s, each side had enough nuclear weapons to destroy the world several times over. You might have heard the phrase, mutually assured destruction, or MAD. It sounds a bit ironic, but the theory was that if both sides could destroy each other, then neither would dare start a war. As if the arms race wasn't enough, the US and Soviet Union also took their competition to space. The space race was about more than just rockets, it was a battle to show which system, capitalism or communism, could reach beyond Earth first. In 1957, the Soviets launched Sputnik, the first artificial satellite, shocking the United States. This led to the creation of NASA in 1958, and the race was on. The Soviets achieved a lot of firsts. First human in space, Yuri Gagarin in 1961, first woman in space, Valentina Tereshkova in 1963, and the first spacewalk. But in 1969, the US made history when Apollo 11 landed on the moon, with Neil Armstrong becoming the first human to set foot on its surface. The space race wasn't just about national pride, it was about proving which system could achieve the unthinkable. Of course, the Cold War didn't stay in the stratosphere. It was also fought on the ground, in places we now call proxy wars. The US and Soviet Union never fought each other directly, but they did support opposing sides in conflicts around the world. For example, in the Korean War 1950–1953, the US backed South Korea, while the Soviet Union supported North Korea. This pattern repeated in places like Vietnam, where the US supported the South, and in Afghanistan in the 1980s, where the US funded Afghan rebels fighting against the Soviet-backed government. Then, there were the intelligence battles, with spies, secret agents, and covert operations on both sides. Organizations like the CIA in the US and the KGB in the Soviet Union were constantly working to gather information, influence politics, and sometimes even assassinate targets. There were tense moments like the U-2 spy plane incident in 1960, when a US spy plane was shot down over Soviet airspace. It was a constant back and forth of spying and counter-spying, with each side trying to stay one step ahead. One of the scariest moments of the Cold War happened in 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Soviet Union had secretly placed nuclear missiles in Cuba, just 90 miles from Florida. When U.S. surveillance planes discovered the missiles, President John F. Kennedy ordered a naval blockade to stop more Soviet ships from bringing in additional missiles. For 13 tense days, the world was on the brink of nuclear war. People were genuinely scared, many thought that was it, the world was going to end. Luckily, diplomacy won out, and Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev agreed to remove the missiles in exchange for the U.S. not invading Cuba and secretly removing its missiles from Turkey. This was the closest we came to World War III during the Cold War. Another defining feature of the Cold War was the Berlin Wall, which went up in 1961. Berlin was a divided city in the heart of East Germany, and people in East Berlin began fleeing to the west, where life was freer and opportunities were greater. To stop this, East Germany, backed by the Soviet Union, built a wall, cutting the city in two. For almost 30 years, families and friends were separated, and anyone who tried to cross faced prison or death. The wall became a powerful symbol of the Cold War, representing not just a physical barrier but the ideological divide between East and West. As we moved into the 1980s, things started to change. The Soviet Union was facing serious economic problems. It had spent massive amounts on military spending, but its economy was lagging, and its citizens were becoming restless. In 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev came to power in the Soviet Union and introduced policies of glasnost, openness, and perestroika restructuring. These reforms aimed to make the Soviet Union more transparent and improve the economy. But they also opened the door to criticism of the government and calls for freedom across Eastern Europe. In 1989, the Berlin Wall came down. Thousands of people took to the streets, and for the first time in nearly 3 decades, East and West Berliners could move freely. The fall of the Berlin Wall was a huge moment in Cold War history and a signal that the Soviet grip on Eastern Europe was weakening. Finally, in 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed. The republics that made up the Soviet Union declared independence, and the Cold War officially ended. The world celebrated the end of an era marked by constant fear and tension. So, why does the Cold War matter today? It shaped the modern world in countless ways. NATO was formed as a military alliance to counter Soviet power, and many countries aligned themselves with either the US or the Soviet Union, creating alliances that still exist. The technology we use today, from satellites to computers, was driven in part by Cold War competition. And the nuclear arsenals built during this time still influence global security. The Cold War was a massive, complex period that shaped international relations, technology, culture, and even how we think about peace and conflict. It's a story of rivalry, ideology, and the power of diplomacy in preventing disaster. Thanks for joining me on Danis Podcast today for this deep dive into the Cold War. If you enjoyed this episode, hit that subscribe button and let us know what other historical events you'd like to hear about. Stay curious, and I'll catch you in the next episode.